Hey everyone, welcome back to another AskGN. This is the second one we've filmed in a day, basically. And so Snowflake's not opening with me on this one. She was in the previous episode in 110 if you want to see that. This is the series where we take viewer questions. You can leave your questions in the comment section below, and we'll try to get to as many of them as we can for the next episode. We also read them from the Patreon Discord. So if you go to patreon.com/gamersnexus and go to the AskGN's Discord, you can post your questions there, and we'll try and take some of those. We also push some of those to a separate patrons only AskGN episode. It's a bonus episode we do, and we've got a couple up from recent publications that you can check out if you haven't seen any of them. Before that, this video is brought to you by Thermal Grizzly's Conductonaut liquid metal. Conductonaut is what we've used in all of our liquid metal and delid thermal tests, capable of dropping CPU thermals significantly when replacing the stock thermal interface. Lower CPU thermals don't just allow better overclocks, but also lower noise levels because the transfer efficiency is increased. The mix of gallium and indium makes for a thermal conductivity of 73 watts per meter Kelvin, outclassing traditional pastes significantly. Learn more at the link in the description below. All right, so like I said, post your questions in the comment section or go to the patreon.com/gamersnexus Discord and get some in there because we need some more for the next patrons bonus AskGN. This one will have questions from both YouTube and the Discord. So first one is from, and I'll mention this as well, in episode 1, I think it was 10, just before this one, we have some really good questions about things like silicon ingots and how they're grown. So if you're curious about that, you can check out that episode where I got an answer from David Cantor for that one, who's an analyst in the industry. This one is from Bavor NA, who said, this is a long question, but it's a good one. Was the 3950X really a paper launch? There was next to no reasonable inventory available on launch day. Amazon and Newegg sold out of their launch day inventory in less than 2 minutes. According to people who waited in line before opening on launch day at Microcenter, most Microcenter stores receive between 10 and 20 3950X CPUs. I would take that number with, I don't know how much I trust that number, but it was not a lot for sure. That comes out to about 500 CPUs or less for the entire nationwide Microcenter. Okay, let's stop extrapolating there. The asker goes on to mention about how Amazon was limited stock too. Newegg sells out every time it's restocked, stuff like that. And I'll point out this separately. You may have also seen the criminal pricing, almost, of the 3950X on some retailers where it'll be as much as $900 or $1,000, which that's not AMD making that money. That's the retailer making that money. And sometimes it's a third party on the retailer's platform like Amazon or Newegg where there's a third party seller involved. Please don't pay that much money for a 3950X. They're good CPUs, but in almost every instance, you could probably wait a little bit longer and not get gouged the extra $250+ just because of the fervor around it. It's a good CPU, but $1,000 is just, it's so high over MSRP that it hurts. It hurts to see people pay that much. And we've seen it, by the way, because in our affiliate data, where we can see the units that are purchased by viewers of our content, you'll see like a whole bunch of 3950Xs, and then you'll see the price, and it's like $750, $750, $750. There's a whole bunch of $999s. So a bunch of people through our links ended up overspending because they wanted to get the 3950X, which is understandable, but it was at an insane price. So that hurts to see. Now, to answer your question extremely directly, the question being, was the 3950X really a paper launch? My answer is yes, and that's the same answer I'd give if you asked me if Threadripper 3 is a paper launch, or if the 10980XE is a paper launch, or any of the 10 series for that instance. Both AMD and Intel paper launched their products leading into Thanksgiving, and there's a few reasons for that, but the primary two are that, one, there's Black Friday coming up and Cyber Monday, and both companies wanted to make sure they got their products onto market available for purchase before those two, we'll call them holidays, even though they're consumerism holidays now, which is probably more of a holiday than a proper holiday. So they wanted to hit market before those two big buying dates hit. They're the biggest of the year, and December, early December, end of November is the biggest consumer purchasing season of the year. So part of that, you might be asking, well, but if they don't have inventory, what's the point? Well, they can sell the inventory they do have, and then probably more critically to each of the companies, and this is point 2 out of the 2 I wanted to offer, is that they can oppose each other directly while both launching the same product, so that what each company is trying to do is when you say, you know, I kind of want to buy the new Threadripper 3 CPU, but there's also this 10980XE, and the Threadripper chip's not in stock. They're hoping that maybe some people shift over to buy the other one because that one's in stock. Or it could just be that trying to get, obviously, some of the spotlight away from the other companies so that they don't exist in a vacuum independently. So Intel doesn't want AMD to exist independently with Threadripper 3 when it launches, and vice versa. AMD certainly didn't want Intel to be the only one out with the 10 series when AMD, in most instances, had the better product, especially price for price. So they don't want Intel to sit there uncontested for another month while AMD tries to accumulate stock, because what's the point of that? If you push your product out as a paper launch to reviewers and get reviews that say this is better, even though it's not available, you'll still have the would-be buyers, the consumers, watching the content and going, you know, this Threadripper thing looks pretty good. This 3950X looks pretty good. It's not in stock, but I'd rather wait for this than buy the Intel part. And that's kind of what both companies are hoping for. Obviously, Intel is hoping the inverse of that. But yeah, so that's why that happens. Black Friday and Cyber Monday are the primary reasons. And then as for why this happens, first of all, paper launches are really annoying. But that I think if we try to look at it from the company perspectives, that's what they're seeing. It's all competitive and trying to screw each other over as much as they can. As for why it's happening, though, AMD didn't buy enough wafer supply. That's all there is to it. Either it underpredicted demand or it's pushing its supply over to server, which makes sense. AMD has a big server business these days. Margins typically higher in server and enterprise. And probably more importantly, there are contracts in place for server and enterprise and data center that AMD has to fulfill. And some of those are government contracts. We've talked about this in Hardware News recently, where AMD's got contracts with, I think there's an agency in the UK, I don't remember which one, but it was in a Hardware News episode. And they're in supercomputers now for EPYC. And those are all pretty much the same chiplets, which is the cool thing about the Zen architecture, and the reason AMD can sell the chips, some of them for as cheap as they can, because it's not a monolithic die. It's a multi-die approach, chiplet approach, where they take the same thing and put it in a different quantity on the different substrates and sell it as a new product, which isn't to say anything bad about it at all. It's actually brilliant because it allows the price to be lower and it allows AMD to shift what it's making based on the demand. So because EPYC is doing so incredibly well right now, and I mentioned this in the previous AskGN, but our web host is starting to spin up a lot of those. That's Linode, which is also presently a sponsor of the channel. They're spinning up more EPYC servers as well. So when you've got these enterprise clients who are lining up at the door, yeah, AMD's going to move some of that chiplet supply over to server instead of just making all 3950Xs, which is unfortunate for enthusiasts, but AMD, as any responsible company would do, is going where the money is, just like Intel tries to do by making a lot of whatever it can make right now with its 14 nanometer shortage. That's why you saw the Pentium lines die, because Intel had to shift it all over to 9900Ks or server parts, because they had limited fab space and wafer supply for 14 nanometer, especially fab space for 14 nanometer. So, paper launch, answer is yes. Reasons why: AMD didn't buy enough supply, and server demand, things like that. Fighting with Intel, competitive reasons, as explained earlier. And then AMD also is fighting for 7 nanometer with big companies. NVIDIA soon will be buying from TSMC, it looks like, for 7. There's Apple, there's Huawei, and then the government demand is also there. So 10980, 10900X especially was a paper launch. You couldn't even buy the other 10 series chips, the non-980 at all, basically. We got lucky and saw one pop up on Newegg before it was gone again and bought that one when we reviewed it. So they're all paper launches all the way down. Next one is from Misshapen Ape, is the asker, who said, why does AMD not include more Vega CUs on their new Ryzen-based APUs? They're interesting and provide a nice alternative to discrete GPUs for people on certain budgets. 10 and 11 units seem to be their upper end for both desktop and mobile platforms, respectively. Is the problem diminishing returns, physical space limitations, power limitations? So I think I can answer this pretty efficiently. First reason is space. There's a physical space requirement for that componentry on the silicon. So when you're putting more of an IGP in there, you're cramming more of that in, take up something like some percentage of the die. And I don't know what the numbers are off the top of my head for the modern generation stuff, but I know for some of the previous APUs and Intel IGPs, you're looking at up 40% or a bit more of the die for the GPU component. It's taking an awful lot of it when you could have more CPU stuff on there instead. So there's a sacrifice of CPU in favor of the GPU, and that's a physical space limitation for one. Two is cost. You talk about a nice alternative for discrete GPUs on a certain budget. That's absolutely true. That's what they're meant for. But you start looking at the 3400G or the previous 2400G, and the pricing is getting so damn high that it's barely tenable to begin with. And now you start talking about making an even better GPU on those, and it starts to get hard to justify versus a cheaper discrete CPU-only product and discrete GPU-only product. Even if they're both low-end, you might be able to accomplish it for cheaper together with better overall performance, as we've seen. So implementations in portable devices, obviously notwithstanding, because they have physical space limitations, but mostly space is the answer to that. Power is also, yes, a consideration. Diminishing returns, I'm not sure about. I'd have to assume that there's a bit more space for returns or gains with the Vega implementations on those APUs, because I don't think they're becoming CPU bound, even though they're taking so much of the CPU space. I think it's still GPU bound. So there might be some more space, and we know that Vega will scale reasonably to about 56 CUs on a big product with dedicated memory on the board and all that stuff. Now that doesn't directly translate to an APU where you completely change everything, including the memory, especially the memory. But I would think there might be a bit more scaling. I'm just not sure. I think the other two parts of the answer, though, were the main part. Next one is from Shunya Atma, who says, is AI or machine learning all hype? The answer to this question is pretty straightforward. No, it's not all hype. You posted that comment on a YouTube video on YouTube, which you probably found our channel through machine learning and AI. YouTube is frequently discussed, often with a negative intonation, about the algorithm. Well, it's in most instances, there aren't programmers sitting there writing how it works anymore. It's done by whatever base structure they wrote and then extrapolated out through machine learning, through A/B testing, things like that. Even the interface is A/B tested these days, where they'll run different interfaces by you and try to gauge performance by tracking what the mouse does. So that's all machine learning, all AI, and no, it's most certainly not all hype. The future is, in a lot of ways, especially manufacturing, going to be AI. We've seen a lot of that firsthand in some of the factories as they start rolling out more of these implementations that eliminate as many human components of the process as possible, because one, cost, and two, labor availability in certain regions. So no, it is not all hype. There's some really cool stuff you can do with it. I'll cite one example. So recently, Andrew alerted me to this channel, but I think there's a channel called, I want to say it's 2 Minute Papers, I think. And they have some pretty cool AI and machine learning discussions on academic papers that were submitted. One of them is more maybe fun or interesting than immediately applicable, but it's a game of hide and seek between AI teams, and you can see how they kind of figure out the game. And you could see where in an entertainment application like gaming, it could be useful for potentially actual AI players, but in a real world, greater application, it starts being able to more efficiently, Amazon is a great example, being able to more efficiently do jobs than humans could do. So Amazon's warehouses, they're not randomly putting stuff on shelves and randomly putting the shelves in aisles of like home products and computer products and whatever. A lot of that is sorted by machine learning and working through the process of shipping all the stuff and figuring out what's the most efficient placement of this stuff. People buying X, do they most often buy Y or Z? And if they most often buy Y, we should make sure Y is next to X so that we can speed up the process. So no, it is most certainly not all hype. Next one, EVPointMaster says, I reuse thermal pads after taking my GPU apart. Oh, can I reuse thermal pads after taking it apart, or do I need to put on new ones? Is there a noticeable difference in thermals? No, not really a noticeable difference. If you're talking about one disassembly and it's still a new product, just keep them on there. The only time I would start considering replacing them is if they get destroyed in the process of taking it apart. Sometimes that happens, especially with those Fuji poly pads. I would also consider replacing them if they're those harder, normally gray, like almost crusty pads, where if the GPU's been in service for a while, and dust is in the system, sometimes you'll see the dust just kind of collect around the edges of the thermal pad and get stuck to it. And that's an instance where I would just replace it once it's got dust all over the borders. I don't like putting that back in because then you're dealing with dust and it's going to get somewhere else, like the fans later. So you might as well just clean it out while the whole card's open anyway. Done all the hard work at that point. The answer generally though is no. You don't have to replace them. If you get a card in and you're not happy with the performance, you want to remount it because it's a 5700 or something and it's got bad bouncing pressure out of the factory, and you want to put new paste on it because you think the stuff they used is bad, go for it. Just leave the pads on there. You'll be fine. Replace them if they get torn, and if you replace them, obviously make sure they're the same size in terms of thickness so you don't apply any undue pressure on any part of the PCB, and just so it works properly so that the other pads aren't not making connection anymore. Next one is from, oh, this is a good one actually. I think the name was just US. A couple months ago, so on that last AskGN video we published, said, what kind of workflow did your editors use to organize and search all that factory footage you captured? How much space did it take? This is a place where AI or machine learning would be really useful, but it's not an application we have yet. You've probably seen stuff on your phone lately where the phones now offer the facial recognition for photographs so it can categorize people in the phone. I'm not really a big fan of feeding that kind of data into a phone, but the point of bringing it up is that for something like factory footage, it'd be nice to be able to recognize different factories or parts of machines based on what's on camera. But we don't have that. So what kind of workflow did we use and how much space did it take? I checked, and after transcoding it down, it's old enough now that we've transcoded it and deleted the source files. We are at 80 gigabytes after transcoding. I'm sure it was significantly larger before that. It was probably a couple hundred gigabytes, maybe approaching a terabyte. And that's all 1080p footage because when we're traveling, we shoot 1080p. We don't want to blow out the laptop storage with 4K files since we take so much. And in terms of organization, there's nothing fancy. We have folders by name of the company or the location. So you'll see like EVGA, MSI, Cooler Master, stuff like that. For Cooler Master, it gets split in some inefficient ways that I don't really like, but there's not a better way to do it on the road. So we split it into day 1, 2, and 3. And ideally what we would do is split it into like heat pipe factory, glass factory, screw factory, stuff like that, case factory. But the problem is that when we're doing the tour, we don't necessarily know what we're going to see and in what order for the day. So we just collect all the footage and then dump it onto the laptop at the end of the day, and that's just how it stays. And then just mostly rely on experience and memory to find it. So unfortunately, I don't have a fancy answer for you. That's all there is to it. And I think we only have a couple left here. So one of them, Retro Rig Gamer, says, a long-time viewer, first-time commenting. Thank you for commenting. Anyway, with AMD's chiplet CPU design, is delidding not really a thing anymore? And if one were to delid their AMD processor, how would they install thermal paste and heatsink or water block? Lastly, will you be doing Zen 2 or 3 delidding videos? It seems AMD's CPU performance being heavily reliant on temperature. I almost think people might want to delid. You're right in that aspect. No, we're not planning to do any delidding stuff, and we obviously weren't at the time you posted that either, but see, it continued to say, it's not a single die under the IHS, so that makes me wonder if it's possible and worth the risks. Well, it is possible, and you can get it down to enough of a science where it's worth the risks insofar as you can eliminate most of them with care and the right tools. We delidded the 2200G, I think it was, with no issues at all. Now that said, some people delidded that same CPU and ripped off the entire line of capacitors on one side. So there is some risk involved, certainly, but it can be done. Rocket Cool has delidders for the APU parts. I don't know, like, when you get into the new CPUs or the desktop CPUs that aren't paste, like the APUs were paste, that's why we delidded it. You're talking about solder at this point. So now you need to be careful because you could start ripping bits and pieces of the CPU off that aren't just the SMDs, but potentially damage the silicon too. And there's a process you want to go through for delidding those, like heating it up first. And Roman, Der Bauer, has probably done the best coverage of that process because he's done it recently. So I'd check his video if you really want to do it. But really, to answer the question, you can get a thermal improvement in that primarily you're reducing the gap between the silicon and the IHS. So that, even though it's not like it's an air gap because there's solder in there, but you're still removing a relatively thick layer of solder, and you could put an extremely thin, like paper thin layer of liquid metal on it, and then you get rid of the silicone adhesive, that black glue around the border, and you smush it all down a lot closer to each other. The downside is that it's really not that worth it. It's not worth it, in my opinion, at all. But it's just, I don't know, like the solder is good enough where it kind of gets you most of the way there. Places where I dislike solder would be if I'm doing extreme-ish overclocking, but not quite exotic cooling. So if I'm doing something like chilled water or just a really big open loop, and I want as much OC as I can out of it for competitive reasons, but I can't go to liquid metal, or rather I can go to liquid metal, but I can't go to XOC temps where you'd want, the solder would make more sense there anyway, then delidding it makes sense for all of that, where you're dealing with cold but not extreme cold. Liquid metal is going to get you an extra couple degrees improvement. Yes, we saw that with the 9900K as well, and we didn't even do that great of a job delidding it, but it was still improved with liquid or with different paste, especially. So, is it worth it? In my opinion, no. Does it improve things? Yes, if done properly. And is it risky? Yes. Is it worth the risk? In general, no, but depending on what you're trying to do with it, perhaps. Just make sure you have the right tools, do the research, and take your time with it. It's possible to delid them without damaging it. We've done it, but I wouldn't necessarily recommend it. Jock McBile. I've never asked a question, but I want to say thank you, Steve and crew. Often I don't know what people are asking, but it's interesting to me, and I try to keep it in mind when I'm facing issues myself. I use this channel to try and build confidence in my own endeavors. Thanks again. Well, don't forget to check out The Verge, where they recommend that you screw with confidence. And thanks for the kind words. Next one, Internet Entity says, this is in response to in episode 108 or 9, we had a bunch of Australian viewers write in and explain to us how fans work in Australia, as in case fans. So what I've learned is that case fans in Australia don't, I was wondering, maybe they spin backwards because it's on the other hemisphere, but actually they spin the same way. It's just that the computer is colder than, this is more true now, sadly, than it was then. The computer is colder than ambient, so it goes backwards. So this is a continuation of that obvious joking. Internet Entity said, I can confirm here in Great Britain, water cooling is more viable than in Australia. Just have a funnel hung on a bracket outside and run a tube through the window. That explains my experience when I was in the UK briefly. A lot of rain. Thanks for watching. Leave your questions in the comment section below or on the Patreon Discord, and subscribe for more. Go to store.gamersnexus.net to help us out directly. I'll see you all next time.